Hi, my name is Alicia Ajay. I'm an architect, and I'll just get started. There's a frightful silence in American history, and we're still grappling with its echoes today. The silence willfully hides the heroic stories of those before me. What we do not see is the work of Black town builders who risked their lives to put stakes in the ground and claim space as slavery flourished in this country. They made do with what was perceived to be uninhabitable lands with no wealth, no certainty of a future, in constant fear of white retribution, and they made Black spaces. Spaces where they could begin the act of living freedom. That same silence obscured the story of Brooklyn, Illinois until today. According to oral tradition, in 1829, Priscilla Baltimore, a free Black woman, led 11 families consisting of freed and escaped Blacks out of Missouri. They left the slaveholding state and crossed the mighty Mississippi River. Then they settled in a densely wooded area, making sure to be out of sight of slave catchers, but remained close to the river on the Illinois side, so they could easily be reached by others escaping slavery. Over some decades, the refugee camp turned into a settlement and then turned into an organized town now called Brooklyn, Illinois. However, according to oral tradition, they called it Freedom Village. Much later, after Brooklyn's founding, the village adopted a motto which reads, "Founded by chance, sustained by courage." And in a way, it perfectly links Brooklyn's history to its present. But it's really the founded by chance part of the model that I'm really interested in, because I think it provides an opportunity to challenge the idea that Black town building wasn't just happenstance, but the impact of Black towns during the antebellum period, like Brooklyn, Illinois, have been widely overlooked, dismissed, or erased from our nation's history. But for me, Brooklyn's story opened a window to a radical movement of Black activism, which predated the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, and the abolishment of slavery with the 13th Amendment in 1865. It also predated the much more public and documented moment of the civil rights movement during the 50s and 60s by at least a century or so. In fact, I tend to think of this period of Black town building as the original civil rights movement that American history is just unaware of. However, the story of Brooklyn, Illinois, and other Black towns is one that needs to be understood in order to reconcile America's past with its present in hope to create a better future. I was trained as an architect, so my research is mainly focused on the legacy of these kind of spatial tactics used by Black pioneers. We call it a freedom village. The name of the project is an attempt to look at the past in order to build on the foundation that my ancestors have already laid. As slavery was developed in this country in the mid-1600s, slave laws surfaced shortly afterwards, and it began the legal maneuvering of defining what a slave was. In Cheryl Harris's monumental paper entitled "Whiteness as Property," published in 1993, the law professor claims that as property emerged, it was racialized due to the notion that human life could be propertied in legal terms. The code solidified, slave is Black, free is white. The racialized word association legally meant Black life could be sold, inherited, or used as collateral, just like property, or just like we imagine property to be used today. Such property rights were only to be assumed by whiteness in its making. In that paper, in Harris's paper, she goes on to say that owning white identity as property affirmed the self-identity and liberty of whites, and conversely denied the self-identity and liberty of Blacks. If to be white was to own property, then to be Black was to be propertyless. Slavery and property grew up together in this country, and despite the 13th Amendment abolishing legal ownership in 1865, the deep-rooted sentiment of owning Blackness permeated the American identity. So in many ways, the only strategy available to Blacks to significantly subvert slavery had to be spatial, at least until the legal structure of slavery fell during the Reconstruction era, which happened between 1865 and 1877. Brooklyn's existence was proof that Blacks could liberate themselves by taking up space, literally. One of the main spatial tactics deployed by Black residents of Brooklyn was the same tool that was kind of used to exercise racial persecution, which was property accumulation. This is best seen through Priscilla Baltimore's story, who was and is affectionately still known as Mother Baltimore. I consider Mother Baltimore as kind of a tactical spatial agent, and she's become kind of a spirit guide for me in the research. Mother Baltimore was born in 1801 on a plantation in Kentucky. She spent a number of her years enslaved on Mississippi River boats, earning her freedom from landing in St. Louis, before landing in St. Louis and becoming a well-respected woman in the Black and white communities. Mother Baltimore was a minister, a businesswoman, a nurse, a caregiver, a property owner, and an unofficial conductor on the Underground Railroad. From at least the 1820s to the time of her death in 1882, Mother Baltimore moved back and forth between Brooklyn and St. Louis. We know this because she owned property in both places and because of census records. Baltimore, like so many other enslaved Blacks, saw beyond her circumstance as a slave and dreamt of the promised land of freedom. Maneuvering within the legally and thinly veiled confines of slaveocracy, she secured her dream legally by purchasing her own freedom, not once, but twice. The reclaiming of one's own Black body was the first spatial tactic one could do. Some did this by running away, and others, like Mother Baltimore, did it by obtaining their freedom through papers known as free Negro bonds. Actually, these precious pieces of paper were called many things: freedom papers, certificate of freedom, deed of manumission. These were all used for these legal documents. And these legal documents emancipated former persons in bondage from slavery through the act of manumission in antebellum America. Although Baltimore had bought her freedom decades before the bond pictured here, she bought her freedom again in 1861, which is what this bond is showing. This was an incredible feat to do, not just once, but for Baltimore to accomplish this twice is a sign that this Black woman was hard at work. As the country edged its way to the inevitable Civil War, which started 4 years after Baltimore bought this particular bond, tensions and hostilities against free Blacks in particular rose in the South. And the need to protect enslaved Blacks from the notion of freedom became a priority for slaveholders. Bonds, which were administered at the state level and restricted Blacks from entering and leaving certain states, became harsher and more enforced regularly. Baltimore most likely double paid for her freedom so that she could get her papers registered in Missouri, in the state of Missouri. This would allow her to move in and out of Missouri freely, and I'll touch on why this is so important later. But free Negro bonds are what Frederick Douglass called devices of slaveholding ingenuity, are of course now paper artifacts born from an extinct legal system which relied on the idea that Blackness was something to be owned, or more specifically, propertied. They are important artifacts to study because they represent the complication of bondage and freedom, which is to say one cannot exist without the other. The bond concretized the authority of dominance for those who had the power to grant it, but the bond also became an extension of one's body, especially for Blacks, and an extension of one's body and soul, creating a spatial consciousness of self, which existed in freedom. Bonds allowed for a new kind of imagining that would be legally protected. The bond, therefore, solidified the transference of being property, that is to be enslaved, to having property, being free. In other words, before Baltimore could imagine what a space of Black liberation could look like, there had to be her bond. Of course, property accumulation also happened through land accumulation. This is the tactic I came to in this research, thinking would be like the main thread in the work. And in a lot of ways, this is the crux of the entire project. Black land accumulation meant more than just claiming land, but gave Black legal rights to it, gave Blacks legal rights to it. In 1837, 5 white men platted what is now called Brooklyn. But in 1841, Mother Baltimore, along with her husband, became the first Black landowners in Brooklyn and maintained the highest amount of property wealth for a number of decades. This was an important milestone for Black liberation because it meant that Blacks had rights that could be technically protected. Baltimore, without the help of her husband, built an incredible amount of assets for a Black woman at that time. She owned several properties throughout St. Louis and Brooklyn throughout her life. Local historians and the president of the Historical Society of Brooklyn, which is a organization in Brooklyn that kind of captures this history, they believe that Baltimore attained such an impressive portfolio of assets as a way to sell back to Blacks. So as she was obtaining properties, the theory is that she was selling these properties back to Blacks. Between the year of 1866 and 1869, I know that she sold at least 6 different properties in Brooklyn, and I was able to find out that at least half of those were colored people in Brooklyn, according to census records. But it's worth noting that by 1870, Brooklyn's Black land ownership had nearly doubled in the last 2 decades. Baltimore selling assets to other Blacks could have aided the growth of Black ownership in Brooklyn. Black land ownership becomes critical because up until this time, the town had been biracial, even though it was known as a safe haven for Blacks to inhabit or to live there. But it had been a biracial town with white rule. However, as Blacks gained wealth through property, they began to obtain political control in Brooklyn. And by 1873, Brooklyn became the first incorporated town in the US. That means they were the first legally recognized town in the US. There, of course, are other tactics in play here that I'll touch on briefly. One is Brooklyn's strategic placement right on the threshold of Missouri and Illinois. Again, Missouri was a slave state and Illinois was a free state. And you can see that they're placed right on the border of the Mississippi River, which became a major thoroughway for industry at the time in the mid 1800s. And as the industry grows around this has some real impacts for Brooklyn's residents. One of the main ones is that while most Blacks in the country at the time were working on plantations, whether they were free or not, most of Brooklyn's population was working in local stockyards or factories. So there was an emergence of a Black middle class there that wasn't existing in a lot of other places. So that aided to that property accumulation. There's also the role of the church. Baltimore herself was a preacher for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church. She helped establish the first 2 AME churches in the region. The Paul Quinn AME Church was started in her living room and established physically in Brooklyn, 1839. In Cheryl LaRoche's book, The Geography of Resistance, the author posits that the AME Church network tactically placed its churches in specific geographies to further the movement of liberation and was a crucial actor in the Underground Railroad. The AME Church circuit, established in 1816 in the Northeast, became a powerful Black institution, spreading the word of redemption and liberation. Baltimore, who at one point managed a ferry business, that means she had a ferry that went back and forth between St. Louis and Brooklyn, would have had the means to help slaves escape and help to make Brooklyn one of the first stops on the Underground Railroad. This is another tactical maneuver. Perhaps the most surprising tactic has been the reclaiming of one's identity by naming a place. I first came across the term Freedom Village when reading up initially about Brooklyn in a book titled America's First Black Town, Brooklyn, Illinois, written by Professor of African American Studies at the University of Illinois, Sundiata Keita Chijua. Local scholars and local historians all consistently tethered Brooklyn's history to the term Freedom Village, although almost no one can explain what makes a Freedom Village or how the term came to be. While Chijua doesn't offer an explicit explanation of what a Freedom Village is, he does offer that Brooklyn and other Freedom Villages were simultaneously a response to racial oppression and a result of Black proto-nationalism, which was a commitment to Black empowerment. But I want to take this a step further and say that Brooklyn was a spatial rebellion by claiming space and embodied radical Black placemaking. It's important to remember that Brooklyn is still alive and still fighting for their place in the world. Today, Brooklyn is home to about 600 residents. Despite Brooklyn's rich and somewhat prosperous past, Brooklyn has been in somewhat of a steady decline in the last few decades. The last decades have been shaped by a steady decrease in population, and nearly half of the residents live at or below the poverty line. And there's a tension between descendant communities like Brooklyn and the scholar communities who study them in an effort to revitalize them. I was fortunate enough to interview Miss Roberta Rogers, who is the president of the Historical Society of Brooklyn in Illinois. And she helped to found the organization in 1924 to capture the town's rich history. Ms. Rogers takes issue with Chijua's use of Freedom Village and declares that the town themselves gave it that name, and that it's not just a kind of a typology. In an interview earlier this year, she tells me this: "That's what they called it, Freedom Village. It became a beacon for people escaping slavery because Missouri and Illinois, the only thing that separates us is the Mississippi River. And they would escape on the riverboats. They just named it Freedom Village because everybody was attracted there. And they knew that they could get refuge, food, clothing. They would hide them, protect them with their life, and they would send them on their way." Throughout our conversation, Ms. Rogers' voice is passionate and she sounds protective of the use of Freedom Village. And it's because it's a part of her identity. And she's on a mission to set the record straight so that Brooklyn can survive into the next century. While the nuance between the interpretations might seem rather insignificant, Ms. Rogers gives us another possible spatial tactic, one of giving a name to a place. In some ways, the definition or origin of Freedom Village doesn't really matter because it still holds power today for those who stand to benefit from it the most. By possessing a name so strong and precise as Freedom Village, Ms. Rogers and her community is still practicing spatial rebellion. There's an intentional redundancy in the term radical Black placemaking. I argue that the tension Blacks made to participate in the same capitalist system, which had defaulted their perceived Blackness as nothing more than something to be owned, was radical. In other words, to be Black, to take up space, and to make a place was a radical act, and it still is today. Because we were never meant to have access to space or exercise spatial practices. This history uncovers that the surveillance and policing of Black lives has always manifested itself spatially. But as deep as this history is, there has always been efforts to fight back. In a recent conversation with her son, Earl Sweatshirt, Cheryl Harris continued to echo the silence of slavery recently and said that the after effects of slavery never gets discussed, but this is not quite true. I think, as Jennifer kind of articulated, we've always been talking about this. In a recent Zoom lecture last week, I sat in on a phenomenal talk with 3 Black scholars who talked exclusively about the tactics around Black land ownership. None of these scholars were architects, planners, or designers of the sort, but these issues of creating space for Black life so it can happen unobstructed seemed more pressing than ever and dominated the conversation. I could not help but think and reflect on my time in architecture school and how foreign this conversation would have felt in that space in my studios. So as a Black woman in architecture, I see the reclaiming of my history, which has often been ignored or not deemed important, especially by the Architecture Academy, as a form of research justice, a type of reparative work. And reparative work is active. So I'll end on this. I named this project We Call It Freedom Village because this work is kind of my form of protest, and it's my way of standing in solidarity with Ms. Rogers and the people who live in Brooklyn and all the other Black towns that are struggling to survive. Yeah, and I'll just end it on that. Thank you.